We had the opportunity to meet with Guenter Schroeder, a German scholar and expert on Horn of Africa matters.
Guenter, what was the role of Osman Saleh Sabe in ADOPA at that time?
Officially, Osman Saleh Sabe, he did not have a role in the ADOPA Congress. The ADOPA Congress or conference was the work of the younger militants in the ELF. The more radical elements of different ideological political orientation, but all in agreement that the leadership of the ELF should be based in the field and should rest in the hands of the fighters in the field. They were against the teleguided leadership through the Supreme Council from abroad and with the intermediary through the revolutionary as a command in Kassala. So as a result, at this congress, this conference, the Supreme Council members did not participate as official delegates. The Revolutionary Command in Kassala did not participate as delegates, as members of the conference. Also, the leaderships of the 5 regions did not participate. The commanders of the 5 regions did not participate in the conference. No. But in the conference participated representatives of the Islam movement from Sudan, from the mass organizations there, the younger, more radical elements there. They participated there in the conference, most of them as observers, not as delegates. The delegates were exclusively drawn from the military commands. And after a lot of wrangling, a compromise was found how the commands were to be represented in the conference. The first command and the second command together had a numerical edge over the representative of the tripartite union, the union of the 3rd, 4th and 5th command. So that guaranteed that these two, the Western and Northern command, they had a majority there. And the representatives, the leaders of these commands, they had argued, not the official commanders, but the leaders of the movement for the Congress, they had argued that they had more fighters than the others together. So they met in ADOPA, and after a lot of...
But was it like this in the reality, or just was it fake number?
No, that was a certain reality, yeah. The 5th division was not so strong, and even so the 4th division and the 3rd division had substantial numbers, but still in the Sahel and in Baka.
But anyway, was representative the number which they gave?
Yeah, the numbers were fairly accurate because they know amongst themselves how strong they are. There would not have been much the fudging. But naturally, even so, the Supreme Council was marginalized, did not participate in the Congress. They were present there as bad ghosts. Osman Sabe, he had his supporters in the tripartite union, particularly those people from Samar. Idris Claudius had his supporters, the people from the 2nd division. Yeah. Idris Muhammad Adam, No, the second division was more so Karen, Zenhit, Sahel. So it is Muhammad Adam had his people in the first division. So, and naturally, they tried to influence the outcome of the conference through their people there. Yeah? So it would have been nearly impossible to keep this influence out. Yeah? Also people like Mahmoud Dinai, the commander of the first division, and then the commander of the second division, even though they were not part of the conference, but they had supporters and followers, friends among the delegates, yeah, despite whatever differences existed there concerning leadership, the tactics, ideology, whatnot. So naturally there was an outside influence. The conference took some decisions. One decision was to disband the Supreme Council. The second decision was to organize a merging of the fighting force of the 5 commands into a unified army. A third decision was to organize within a given period a regular congress of the whole ELF. And to achieve these ends, to prepare the merging of the army and to prepare a national congress, preparatory committees were to be set up.
From the Congress of Adoha was settled as that Congress.
Yeah.
First National Congress of ELF.
Yeah, they settled that within a space of 1 or 2 years, given the conditions existed, also from the fighting situation, that a regular first National Congress of the ELF should take place. They consider themselves to be the first step on the way to such a regular Congress. And the Congress mandated the leadership to be elected to set up the preparatory committees for both, for the merging and to prepare the national as a Congress. Thirdly, they were to set up committees to look into the issue of Muslim-Christian tensions, particularly also among the civilian population, but also within the fighting force.
You mean to get a balance of 2 religion backgrounds in this Congress? But what was you told me Osman Saleh Sabe was influential in Adoha Congress.
He was influential through his
participants. Yes,
through the participants, particularly from Semha.
Okay.
Yeah, but naturally they were not the dominant force there.
Perfect. Okay.
But he had people there, so he was informed about what is discussed, and through his people he also tried to give inputs.
Perfect. Okay.
So at the end of the conference, the 38-member leadership was elected. The General Command, composed of 38 members, 10 members each from the first and the second command, and 18 members from the tripartite union. So the second and first command delegates in the central command, they had a majority. Good. Now, among the members from this command, the general command, there were about 8 or 9 people from Semha, and 6 of them considered to be close to Sabe.
Okay.
And but among the delegates from the tripartite union, there was also Abdallah Idris, because he was a member of the 5th command. So, but Abdallah Idris, during the conference, and even particularly later, he sided with the 1st and 2nd Division. Some people from the tripartite union in the general command, they sided with the other two, and Abdallah Idris was rewarded to be appointed the head of the military committee.
In the 1st command?
No,
okay.
Of the whole ELF.
Okay.
Yeah. The general command considered itself to be the leading organ of the ELF, the leadership of the ELF, and they appointed the military committee to run the army, and Abdallah Idris was chief of this committee.
So kind of defense minister.
Kind of defense minister.
Chief of the army, okay.
Yeah. So since the conference of Adopa at the end of 69, September, October 69, Abdallah Idris had been the supreme military commander of the ELF until the demise of the ELF in 1982. And that was what he had aspired for, and that was a position he kept and defended by all means, fair or foul, until he finally broke the ELF in 82.
So which means 11 years he led the army?
Yeah, 13 years.
From 71 until?
No, from 69.
Oh, okay.
From 69 to 82.
So from the Congress of Adoba until dissolving of ELF in 1982?
In March 82.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then after the conference, when the general command met the first time, the question was who is to become the chairman
of the ELF, okay,
of the general command and as such of the ELF, and the different groups present there. The young radicals like Isaias and Ramadan and some others, those people from the young military with Baathist inclination or Iraq political influence or Syrian political influence, whatever. Yeah. So the conservatives there was a lot of wrangling, and finally they settled for a compromise candidate, Mohammed Abdu, and a fairly nondescript fighter.
So what was his origin? 60s fighter?
No, Mohammed Abdu, I think he was from the 1st Division. I'm not 100% sure, but I think he was from the 1st Division. And when the General Command resumed its work, they tried to organize things, to set up the preparatory committees, to dissolve the Supreme Council. But very soon, things went out of hand. Certain elements in the 1st and the 2nd Division linked to Idris Muhammad Adan and Idris Claudius, they allied with these two and used them practically as a kind of external advisors. And they tried to stack the preparatory committees for the merging and for the National Congress with their own supporters, which created internal tensions. Osman Saleh Sabe, he started lobbying abroad against the dissolution of the Supreme Council. He argued that this decision was premature or even illegal. Only the National Congress could decide that. And he used his supporters in the General Command to try to agitate other members of the General Command for this point of view. the majority faction within the General Command, well, they made their own propaganda against Osman Saleh Sabe and for the dissolution of the council, while at the same time maintaining their close ties with Idris Muhammad Adam and the Claudius. And the internal dissension within the General Command reached such a height that Isaias Afewerki and Ramadan Mohammed Noor, the two of the most radical elements in the command, they tendered letters of resignation to the chairman of the General Command. These letters are preserved, they can be found, and they stated clearly that the General Command is, in their opinion, no longer is a body capable of working together and reaching binding decisions acceptable for all. So, parallel to this growing dissension within the General Command, the issue of what to do with the growing number of Christian recruits coming to the ELF. The General Command was riven by internal dissension, the various factions, and also the influence from the former leaders Osman Saleh Sabe, Idris Claudius, Idris Muhammad Adam, working through their followers in the General Command, which led finally to the resignation of Ramadan Isaias from the General Command. Then the majority faction in the General Command in November 1969 took action against the followers of Osman Saleh Sabe in the General Command. 6 members of the General Command were arrested for opposing, that was the official reason given, for opposing the dissolution of the Supreme Council. Upon hearing the arrest of his supporters in the General Command, Osman swiftly reacted. He realized that it is beyond his capacity to influence the General Command any longer, and by extension also to have the dominant influence over the ELF. He called his supporters in the Eritrean diaspora, the ELF outside supporters, as organizations in the bureaus, etc. He consulted with them and he organized a meeting in November 1969. Osman Saleh Sabe, in reaction to the arrests of his supporters in the General Command, he organized a meeting of his supporters among the Eritrean diaspora, or the external ELF supporters and members, in the Amman, in a camp of Palestinians. And there he declared the dissolution of the Supreme Council is illegal, and he dismissed from the Supreme Council those members who supported the dissolution, like Idris Muhammad Adam and Idris Claudius, and he reconstituted a new Supreme Council with him as a chairperson and some other members, and he added new members to it.
So he settled a new leadership under influence of himself.
Under the influence of himself. But interestingly enough, he had managed to win support for his plans from the remnants of the Harakat in Cairo, and the leader of the Harakat, of what was left of Harakat, Mohammed Said Naud, he joined in the Supreme Council and joined the ELF. So, in the sense, also he could enlist the support of Wolde of Woldemariam and Krasmach Asmaron. So he had the two Christian heavyweights in his Supreme Council. And commonly, this Supreme Council of Osman Saleh Sabe is called Qiyada al-Amman. Not Qiyada al-Amma, sondern Qiyada al-Amman, in reference to the place where it was.
So leadership of Amman, Jordan, okay.
Jordan, yeah.
So named by the city of Jordan.
The city of Amman, yeah. And then Osman used this body to agitate and to win followers from within the ELF for his leadership. Parallel to these developments, centering on Osman and his supporters, the internal issue between Christians and Muslims in the ELF became more acute. In the second half of '69, particularly after the Adopa Congress, a larger growing number of Christian young recruits had joined the ELF. Possibly due to the influence of Isaias. One should not forget that Isaias most likely was still in contact with his former colleagues, Haile Duro and Musi Tesfa-Mikael, who had surrendered to the Ethiopians in the '65 and returned to Addis to continue their studies, but who had stayed in contact with Isaias. Whatever the reason was also for the increase of Christian recruits, there was a growing number. So by the end of '69, there were something like 150 to 200 new Christian recruits arriving in Eritrea, on the ELF.
The field, okay.
And they didn't really know what to do with them. In the past, new recruits had been sent to the training unit based in Barca, but one did not feel too confident with putting such a large number there of Christians. So at first, they were assigned Solomon Woldemariam from the 5th Division was assigned to look after them in a special camp. And this group was called Syriat Addis. Then in the discussions what to do with them, the representatives of these recruits, they demanded that they be integrated into the ELF as a coherent fighting unit. As a separate fighting unit, their own as a Fasila. And the military leaders, the military committee of the Central Command refused that. Finally, it was decided to assign to split them up, to assign them as different operational areas to the operational area of the former Second Command and the former First Command.
And what was the influence of Isaias or Osman Saleh Sabe in case of these groups?
Well, the Osman wasn't probably not even really aware of what was going on there. Isaias was aware, and he was in favor of keeping them together and give them military training where they were. But it was decided to split them up, and they were distributed to the different units.
Taghlit, okay. Kind of taghlit.
Yeah.
Okay.
They did not have a full military training, and then those who were assigned to the former Second Command, when they were on the march somewhere, it is not fully clear what happened, but fighting broke out between the older fighters and the new ones. Some of them were killed. Then, due to this,
So who killed whom?
some of armed confrontation broke out, and
who is killing?
a number of members of the Syrian Adis were killed. Others escaped. And then the general command ordered all members of the Syrian Adis to be brought to Baka. And from Baka to be sent to Sahel. And on the way from Baka to Sahel, they disappeared. And
The rest of them, okay.
the rest of them disappeared. And none of those whose names are known reappeared any time later as having escaped or fled to Sudan or back to Ethiopia or whatever. So they simply disappeared from history and life, probably. And it was a general belief
That they had been killed.
it was a general belief by those who opposed the general command that they had been killed by orders, particularly of Abdallah Idris. And the one
Is that true? Do you think it is more to the reality, or?
nobody really knows. The ELF up to today has not properly answered these questions. Some people from the ELF side even accuse Isaias of having had a hand in it. Others accuse this person or that person. One person who most likely would be able to answer what happened would be Saleh Hayoti, who had been the responsible for security in the general command and who was in Baka at that time.
Was that much big the influence of Isaias Afwerki at that time?
No, at that time.
To this group?
No. Well, he had his connections, undoubtedly. Yeah, Solomon Woldemariam was also a close collaborator with Isaias. So naturally they had the links to this group. Yeah, but what reason should have Isaias to have this group being killed? None. Yeah. So, but certain elements in the general command had.
But he was a member of Qiyad al-Amma, a member of this staff during his time, 69.
No, he was not. You see, Qiyad al-Amma was something organized.
Qiyad al-Amma, Qiyad al-Amma. General leadership.
The general command.
Yes.
Yeah. The general command.
He was a member of.
Yeah, but he had October, November, around this time, 69, he had resigned from the general command because he had disagreements with the leadership.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyhow, when the news about the disappearance of Syria Adi spread, also the arrest of these people from Zemma, that accelerated the flight of ELF fighters from the field to Sudan. In Sudan, Woldai and Kiflu, two the ELF fighters, Christians by origin.
You mean Woldai Kiflu or two guys, Woldai and Kiflu and Woldai? I think Woldai Kiflu is the person, the one.
No, there were two persons.
Okay.
Yeah. Kiflu and the other one, I think, Woldai, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't really, Woldai Gide and Kiflu something. Kiflu Tekla, I don't know. Anyhow, these people tried to organize particular Christian fighters fleeing to Sudan. And the General Command found these activities distasteful, obnoxious, and upon order of the General Command, most likely taking into consideration that Muhammad Ismail Abdu was not a strong chairman, most likely Abdallah Idris and other people strong from this side. They organized to have these two people killed in Kassala. The original intention had been to abduct them to the field, to bring them back to Eritrea. But the abduction somehow was bungled, and so they were killed. This, when the news of that spread, this opened the floodgates, and every day dozens of new refugee fighters came to Kassala. In addition, upon the order of the General Command, Ali Zaid Berhatu, an influential representative of the diaspora students, he was also arrested in Kassala and abducted to the field. Now that also
kind of kidnapping, or
yeah, kidnapping.
Okay.
So these people then, these events caused more and more people to leave the field. And Osman Saleh Sabe certainly also had a hand in it.
Collect them again. Okay.
Yeah. He was busy preparing the ground for collecting these fighters, leaving the ELF under his wing. And he finally organized to have them transported from Sudan by airplane to Aden in April 1970. And it was interesting that Sabe at that time, he still had enough talking power in the Arab world to be able to pull this off. I mean, 4 plane loads of deserted ELF fighters from Sudan to Aden, that is not an easy thing, yeah?
So in 69 was expensive.
In 60s, that
yes.
is expensive and needs a lot of political favors. Now the interesting thing is, the South Yemenis, why did they accept it when Osman Saleh approached them? The South Yemenis did not like Osman. They did not allow him to come to Aden. Personally. So he was organizing these things somehow.
But can you explain me? They didn't let him come to the country, but they let him operating in South Yemen. How does...
Well,
it's difficult to understand that.
That has a lot to do with Arab politics. The political tendency which took power in South Yemen in 67, from when they won the independence war against the British. They kicked the British out, and they kicked out the pro-Egyptian Conservative Liberation Front, FLOSI. The National Liberation Front of South Yemen, they took the power. They were independent Arab communists, not linked
to Nasserists, okay.
To the Nasserists, not linked to the Ba'athists, not linked to the Orthodox communist of Moscow type, not linked to communist China type. They were independent Arab communists or socialists. And by 1970, they had brought the Orthodox communists, the Nasserists, the Ba'athists in South Yemen, into a national front dominated by them. The usual way how to deal with minor factions which you want to put under control but are not willing to dissolve them totally and drive them underground. Yeah? By bringing them into a national front, they could keep an eye on these other tendencies. So, and naturally, they were following what the other Arab states are doing, also in regard to Eritrea. After all, South Yemen, there is a sizable community of Eritreans in Aden since ages. They had an interest in what is happening in Eritrea. So they knew that the Iraqi Baathists were training Eritrean soldiers. They knew that the Syrian Baathists were training them. They knew that the Egyptians had their bloody hands in it. And Sudan Communist Party as well, in a sense. Yeah? So from their perspective, being independent of this and in competition with these trends, it was the political advantage to have their own Eritrean force. That was, in my assessment, the rationale behind allowing Osman to bring these dissident fighters to South Yemen for reorganizing.
Makes sense. Okay.
And to bring them back to Eritrea.
Makes sense. Okay. And good. And after he organized logistic help from the Arab world, and he could bring the soldiers from Sudan to Aden.
Yeah.
Easily. Okay.
Well, he somehow pulled it off. And interestingly enough, these people were kept in a camp near Aden, Ma'askar Aden. And according to various sources I have consulted, participants who were in Aden there was a meeting of the most radical elements among these fighters, who discussed plans to form a vanguard communist party within this new fighting force.
So smuggling in this group, smuggling in this group with this ideology.
Well, one of those who was there was Ramadan and also Mesfin Hagos and others. They did not formally form a party then, but they discussed the plans, and that also had its own logic to it, because all these fighters, or at least the more ideologically inclined, were well aware of the formation of the Labour Party in the ELF, which happened around the same time, at the end of 69, beginning of 70, by radical elements within the ELF, like Ibrahim Totil, Hassan Yassin, Umar Mohammed, and others. Yeah?
Most of them, they are socialist and communist ideology influenced. Okay.
Yeah, they had this communist influence. Some of them, at least, had studied at high school or university in Khartoum, influenced by the Sudanese Communist Party being dominant there at that time. And anyhow, they were there. One has to understand also, that is important for future developments, that among those young radicals adhering to communist socialist ideas, it was part and parcel of the political ideology and political thinking that you need to have a front to organize the masses and the liberation struggle. The front has to be as open as possible to have a mobilization effect and capacity, but that such a front preferably should be led by a vanguard party within the front, by a communist vanguard party within the front. And the Labour Party in the ELF was this kind of vanguard party. And those people discussing in the Aden camp in summer 1970, they were adhering to the same concept. They were discussing the possibilities to have their own vanguard party, which only made sense. Yeah? If the ELF has a vanguard party, they also have to have one. And but they did not formalize it and formally establish as a party. But the concept and the germ was there. And then in summer, after some weeks in this camp.
So you are talking about the camp in Aden?
In a camp in Aden.
Okay.
Yeah. They got the additional military training by the Yemenis. The Liberation Front of Dofa, that was a liberation front, the eastern part of South Yemen, no, the southern part of Oman.
Okay.
Dofa, they had their own liberation front, which was also strong left wing. They gave them a donation of $50,000, which was a lot at that time. And finally, Osman Saleh Sabe had it organized to move zone from Aden to southeastern Eritrea, to Dankalia. And then in July 70, around 700 fighters had arrived in Eritrea, in Sudoaela, and they held a meeting there to organize themselves. According to Osman Saleh Sabe, he was also present. But
he was the main organizer of this group, and then also this congress.
Yeah. Well, according to him, he was present.
Okay.
But people who were present, confirmedly present, they say he was not present. So that is something which needs to be corroborated, whether he actually was there or not. Yeah.
It's more ratification. Okay.
Yeah. I asked Osman at that when I met him in Khartoum, and he said yes, as I was there. And I asked him also what he knew about the formation of a secret vanguard party within the ELF, his group. He said yes, as I realized that some young boys, they were sitting separate from the others under some trees and discussing things, but I did not take it serious. Yeah.
So he was attending.
He claimed. Whether it was, let's say, Oriental fantasy or reality, I have not been able to confirm it. Yeah. I have to go back to sources actually, and that is one thing as I will ask Mesfin again. Ramadan Mohammed Noor was not present there. He was somewhere around in the Arab world. But Umaro was there. And the meeting elected a 9-member leadership with Umaro as the head of it. And they gave themselves the name People's Liberation Forces. Eritrean People's Liberation Forces. Also EPLF, yeah. But not front, but forces. And they decided then, they discussed what to do. The Ethiopians and the ELF had learned about their arrival in southeastern Eritrea. And they came under attack by Afar, allied with the ELF and the Eritrean and the Ethiopians. So one of the guys who was also there said Alamin.
Alamin Mohammed Said.
Alamin Mohammed Said, yeah. He was also there. Ahmed Hilal Tatau,
okay.
And many others. So they decided to move north. And they split up.
To the direction of Samar, on the way.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they decided to split up. One group went back to Aden, and from Aden to northern Eritrea. Mesfin Hagos was amongst them. Abu Tiara.
Okay.
Abu Tiara, he went he and some of his supporters, followers from Senhit, from Maria in particular. They had the plan to go to Sahel and Senhit to recruit for the new formations there. Mesfin Hagos had a plan also to go as a north and to recruit as a Christians, possibly also from the northern Sudan, from Port Sudan anyhow. So they moved north. So the group actually moving north was greatly reduced in number. And the story how they marched northwards, it's an epic story. It is not comparable to the long march of the Chinese Red Army, but the suffering of this group of fighters in the desert of Dankalia and how they survived, it is epic.
It's amazing. But was this group of people attacked by the ELF on the way to the north or not?
Well, not directly by the ELF, but they were attacked by the AFA allied with the ELF.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure whether there was a direct attack of the ELF or not. Yeah, but they were under repeated attacks. They lost people on the way, and they find it took them quite some time to move to the north. Yeah. Meanwhile, in other parts of Eritrea, the troubles of the general command continued. People were continuing to flee to Sudan. There was still dissension in the ranks. And the issue of merging the army was burning. And the preparation of the National Congress.
But anyway, the way to split from ELF was starting from this moment, I guess. Guenter, before I go further, I would like to come back on the time of 60s, if you agree with it. So the role of Osman Saleh Sabe told me in the 60s was really deep and great in the Eritrean Revolution. And I could understand from your explanations that he organized all these trainees abroad Eritrea. For example, in Syria, Iraq, he told me in South Yemen, China, and Cuba. Was he the main person who organized these trainees? Where?
Yes, Osman, he was a roving ambassador of the ELF. Idris Muhammad Adem, he had kind of opened the way for him in the beginning, but at the latest in 1962, he was the chief diplomat of the ELF. And he was moving with agility, suave speaker, adaptable like a chameleon to the political context. He could talk with everyone. He could talk a sheikh out of his burnous. He could talk with
the communists,
to the Cubans, to the Baathists, whatever. And as a result of his efforts, he not only managed, as I said, in the Arab world, the ELF could open everywhere offices and work among the Eritrean diaspora there to solicit funds and fighters and support. But he also won the active support of Arab governments, some weapons. And in 1963, he organized the first military training of Eritrean fighters in Syria, in the military academies in Syria. Ramadan Mohammed Noor was among the first group sent to Syria. Shortly later, he organized the training in Iraq. Ultimately, more than 200 Eritrean fighters were trained in military academies in Iraq from 64 to 71.
And among them were also famous fighters like Ahmed Nasser and Abdullah Idris.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. So Abdullah Idris, I think he was trained in Syria.
Not in
Iraq.
Okay.
And but anyhow, he had outside training. Yeah? In 65, he
Ahmed Nasser for sure.
He was for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. In 65, he also organized that people could be trained in Cuba. A group of 5. I think 5 fighters were trained in Cuba. Amongst them, Ibrahim Affa, who was interesting in this regard. He had also come from the Egiko school, but he had not come to Cairo, but he had joined the Ethiopian Armed Navy. He was a naval
Affa.
Yeah. And then he joined the Eritrean Revolution, and he was sent to Cuba. Yeah. So. But
how could he manage it? He is with more, deep Arab influence to get good communication with the Chinese and the Communist Party of Cuba.
Well,
any tricks?
No, not the tricks, but you see, the Arab world in the 60s was a hotbed of competition between the communist states and the Western states. The Chinese, they had embassies in many Arab capitals. And Arab revolutionaries always found listening ears in these embassies. And for example, there was a Somali from Djibouti, then still under French rule, who in 1958 had called upon his people in Djibouti to vote for independence against this French Union. At that time, all the French colonies in Africa were asked to vote whether they would stay with France in a kind of union or not. The only state which refused to stay with France was Guinea under Sékou Touré, who became an icon for African liberation movements. And the guy as Mahmoud Harbi from Djibouti, he lost, he was exiled, and he ended up in Syria. And in Damascus, he had contact with the Eritreans and with Osman Saleh Sabe, but he had also contacts to the Chinese embassy. So these kind of linkages exist.
That's definitely amazing.
And also the Cubans at that time, in the early 60s, they had a very active Africa policy.
They were an accusation. Okay, but
no, you see, they were active in the Arab world. They supported the Algerian liberation struggle. They supported the liberation struggle in Angola, in Mozambique, in Cabo Verde, in the Guinea-Bissau.
Definitely, yes.
They supported the Palestinians. They had embassies in the Arab states. So, for an enterprising guy like Osman Saleh Sabe, who had contacts, he must have had a Rolodex, thick like that, So,
and even in this time, he managed the link to the Chinese colonies, and he could get this green light also to bring people for training to China?
Yeah. He could manage it. He talked at the same time with the Cubans, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and the Chinese, And I mean, he also talked with the Algerians, but the Algerians had their own problems at that time. To my knowledge, nobody was trained there. He did not want to get military training in Egypt because he didn't trust the Egyptians too much. I mean, it is better to have the trainee powers further off, not by the neighbors, would give them maybe too much of a handling in influencing things inside. So he was a genius in that. At the same time, he tried as best as possible to guide the ELF inside the country, to provide logistics, supplies, etc.
So let's bring you back to the first step. I mean, the first group of who used to get the training in China. So during this time, he was living in China, Osman Saleh Sabe, and at the same time, he organized also these trips to China, or he did it from abroad.
Well, he went one time to China where he organized that, and from then onward, all his connection with China probably was through the embassy in Damascus.
Okay, good.
And one should not forget the Osman Saleh Sabe. I mean, his operative headquarters, in a sense, was Damascus. I mean, he also was at home in Cairo, but he had a strong base in Damascus, among other things also because he had a Syrian wife. So, and he was very well familiar with all these diplomatic ins and outs and shenanigans in Damascus.
Was really helpful for the Eritrean revolution. What was do you have any knowledge about the group, the first group of people who used this training in China? Bunch of people, I think 4 or 5.
Well, the first group, the Chinese had agreed to train 5 people. And the Chinese demanded that these 5 trainees should have at least a basic understanding of English and should represent the ethno-cultural diversity of Eritrea. That was when the Osman Sabe decided then to take representative from each of the 5 commands. Which meant he would send 4 Muslims and 1 Christian, which was not really representative of the ethnic religious composition of Eritrea, but you had the 1 command for the Christians, so the 5th command, and the other represented basically Muslim populations.
But anyway, even from the 4, they were from different ethnic groups of Eritrea.
Yeah. So you had from Baka, from the 3rd division, that was the Saho. From Semha, it was the Semha, Tigre. From Zenit and Baka were other groups, Maria and Bani Ama, I think.
You have the names except the popular guy.
I have the names.
All the names?
Yeah. You had Ramadan Mohammed Noor for the 4th division, Isaiah Afovok, bracket question, 5th division. Mohammed Ibrahim Shekini, and he was for the Sahel, for the 2nd division. Ahmed Ibrahim, he was for the 3rd division. Ahmed Ibrahim Secretary, Saho. And Ahmed Adam Umar for Baka, for the 1st division. So.
And how about Isaiah Afovok?
Isaiah Afovok,
So it was from the 5th division?
Theoretically.
Okay. Wasn't he?
No.
So what the first trip to China, to Nanking Military Academy, was with a group of 5 people, and they came back after 6 months to Eritrea.
Yes, they came back after 6 months. As it was a difficult return because to enter from China, they had to go to an Arab country, and from there to make their way into Sudan, and from Sudan then to the field. And all 5 returnees were assigned as political commissioners to their regional commandos. And then, again, in agreement with the Chinese, as a second group of 25 was sent, also representing the ethno-religious diversity of Eritrea. There were around between the 5 and 10 Christians in this group, and also from the other communities. They also were sent to Nanking, and they did their trainings there, also at the height of the revolution, the cultural revolution. With the training was heavy on political ideology, and also the training given before to the 5, it was very strong on the concept of protracted people's war. The concept of protracted people's war means the Liberation Army will not fight a conventional war against a conventional army, but it will fight a people's war, a revolutionary war of long duration, where a major component of this war will be to organize the civilian population economically, politically, socially, to support the armed struggle. So, which was a concept which was theoretically part and parcel of all revolutionary liberation movements in the world, but the Chinese concept was the most refined ones.
Experimental.
Well, they had experienced it in 3 decades of warfare in China. And they had brought the Protected People's War to a victorious conclusion when they, in 1949, they took the power in mainland China. So that was a tested
So do you think it was really compatible to this Eritrean society, this concept?
Well, actually, yes, you see, because until then the ELF, even though it considered itself to be as a kind of revolutionary liberation movement, had done very little outreach into the civilian population. They recruited among the civilian population. They lived by the civilian population, as getting supplies and information networks, etc. They had underground networks, but they had not developed a concept of transforming the revolution, the civilian society, of initiating change in the civilian society, of giving them the goals, aspirations, and concrete achievements to defend and to make them willing, therefore, in defense of their improvements, to support the armed struggle and the armed movement. So they were not a conventional army, as they were moving within the civilian population, had links to the civilian population, but they had not, the ELF had not engaged in a revolutionary transformation of the civilian society. And that is what some cadres, those in China, they learned there about the concept of Protected People's War, that indispensable for that is a revolutionary transformation of civilian society to organize a civilian support base, and which meant to marry, in the Eritrean context, to marry the goal of national liberation in a political sense with a social revolution.
Amazing. So, and the operation was helpful for this group of people. So these 25 people who was in the second group, do you remember any names?
Yes, Said Saleh was there, Mohammed Behan Blatter,
yes,
and
okay.
there were various others. From the Christians, the most known one is the Tesfaye Gebremariam. Tesfaye Hatzir, as he was later called. You see, when this group returned from China, by the time they had arrived in Syria, the general command was in total disarray. Many fighters were fleeing from the field, and they were organizing, trying to be organized, and looking for other options. So, and the Christians in the group did not feel confident to return to Eritrea. So they opted for staying abroad. Tesfaye, the Gebremariam, and others went to Europe, to Italy. Tesfaye went to Germany. He stayed in Sweden, in Bremen, and later
in Germany. Okay.
In Germany, and later on he joined the EPLF. He was a senior cadre of the mass organization of the EPLF in Germany until he returned in 91 to Eritrea, where later he was working in the Ministry of Finance in the budget planning. Incidentally, he married later in Asmara a niece or a cousin of Bereket Zemon, one of the top EPRDF leaders of Eritrean origin. Bereket Zemon had been as a top leader in the Amhara National Democratic Movement, but even then, in 98, he was not influential enough to prevent his relatives. Those trainees from the second group, which returned to the Eritrean field, soon found themselves involved in the various conflicts wrecking the ELF, but only a few of them actually left the field again and joined one of the dissident factions which emerged. Inside the field, in March 1970, the General Command had finally managed to organize the Awata Camp Conference of the main military leaders, where they prepared the final tahlit, the final merger of the armed forces, which was supposed to take place in summer 1970. And at the Awata Camp Conference, it was decided to send Isaias Afewerki and another cadre, military cadre, from the Muslim side, to Ala to contact Abraham Tewolde,
okay.
the former leader of the 5th Command, who was there with a group of fighters. The Adopa Conference had decided that the former heads of the regional command would be allowed to keep a body of armed fighters with them for their personal protection. Abraham Tewolde had retired, or had withdrawn to Ala on the Zemenawi Bahri area, where the 5th Command had a kind of operational base, base. So it was supposed he had there 15 to 20 armed fighters with him And it was rumored and suspected that he had been recruiting additional ones. But there was no other hard confirmation on that. So Isaias was mandated to go there, to talk with him, and to convince Abraham to go with his fighters to Barca, so that he and his fighters could participate in the general merger of the Eritrean Liberation Army into a unified military force. On their way to Ala, the companion of Isaias, separated from Isaias for reasons unknown, and returned to Barca. And
so in this case, Isaias was alone with Abraham Walde?
Well, Isaias continued alone on his way to Abraham Walde, and after his companion had left, the general command no longer had any link or information about the whereabouts of Isaias. So he went off their radar. They did not receive any kind of feedback by him about his mission. Some weeks later, or months later, the general command sent someone from Agordat to Ala to find out what happened to Isaias. It was a Christian teacher from one of the schools in Agordat, a member of the ELF. He went there and he found Isaias in command of the Ala group. Abraham de Walde had already died, and according to what this person whom I met in Kassala 2 decades later told me, Abraham de Walde had died before Isaias arrived in Ala due to stomach problem. And later on, the brother of Abraham de Walde, Gebra de Walde, one of the brigade commanders of the ELF, they accused Isaias to have poisoned Abraham de Walde, but there is no proof of that. And it would also not be, well, Isaias might have ordered competitors to be arrested or killed, but Isaias does not have the mentality of a poisoner. He would take other actions against rivals. But poison, no, I don't think so. No.
Do you think it is only speculation that would be told by the people who are telling that he got poisoned?
Well,
so, but anyway, some of them, his colleagues tell the stories that Isaias was there after Isaias left the place. Happened this incident.
Well, whatever you say, it is part and parcel of the local culture, of Habesha Highland culture in Eritrea, to believe in conspiracies and speculation. And if there are 99 reasonable explanations for an event and one conspirational explanation, they will always opt for the conspirational one.
Perfect. Okay. Good.
So, but as I said, you see, my source told me, as I said, I cannot look into the mind of the people. I can only listen to it, compare, and analyze it. And as I said, this information plus my personal assessment that the application of poison would be unlikely with the personality of Isaias leads me to the belief that the Abraham de Walde died of natural causes, whether before Isaias arrived there or while Isaias was there. In any case, in summer 70, he was in command of the group in Ala. And in addition, that is also what my contact, my informant told me, there were new recruits there in Ala. So obviously, Isaias, through his contacts in Addis, was directing new recruits, Christian recruits, to join the group in Ala. Because Abraham de Wolde, he did not have this kind of link to Addis, but Isaias had it. So something might have been cooking there, simply as such. Good. While this was happening, the group in Ala, under the leadership of Isaias, slowly growing, they sent out missives to Addis Ababa and to Asmara, to the university, to the high schools, where they announced themselves and where they tried to win new recruits. They described themselves as Selfie-Netzanet, the Freedom Party. And in these missives, of which unfortunately no copy has survived, to my knowledge, they explained their reason for going in separate from the ELF. The reasons why they are going separate from the ELF basically were those which later on were explained in detail in this paper, Nehnan Elaman, which was made public in early 71, but most likely written before that by the group around Isaias, where they said they had to split and go their own way because due to the sectarian religious conflict in the ELF, the Eritrean revolution was in danger to be totally and irrevocably split along ethno-religious lines, and that would be to the detriment, to the negative for the survival of the Eritrean revolution as a whole. And they accused the leadership of the general command and certain elements, particular, of being responsible for this development, that the mistrust of the Christian against the Christians, the Christian fighters, but also the Christian civilian population is intolerable. And they outlined their concept of a secular Eritrean nationalism.
By that time, okay.
Yeah, without any reference to Ethiopia or to the Arab world. Obviously, these young intellectuals Isaias was collecting around him, they had realized that the Eritrean nationalism of the ELF was heavily biased or imbued with Arabism and Islamism even, with a view of the Eritrean nation of being part of the Arab world, of the Arab Islamic Ummah. At the same time, they had, as Christian Orthodox, being much closer to the thinking and the Ethiopian culture than the Muslim Eritreans.
So they understood that
they understood it.
Alternative.
They understood clearly that the emperor and his government were trying to tie the Eritrean Orthodox Christians to Ethiopia through an appeal of a kind of imperial Christian nationalism. And their way out of this dilemma of seeing Eritrea split between the two competing versions of nationalism, the third way would be a rigid secular Eritrean nationalism.
Right. So Guenter, let me come back to the previous content of my interview. And Sabe was one of the organizers of these trainees to the foreign countries, more or less. with a socialist influence. So Syria was Ba'ath socialist, and Iraq was Ba'ath socialist, kind of Iraqi socialism. And two other countries like China and Cuba, plus South Yemen.
South Yemen was later.
South Yemen was later. But anyway, and all these trainings was organized by Sabe, and it brings also and upgraded the capacity of the military knowledge in the Eritrean Liberation Front. Was it like this?
Yeah, you see, Sabe, what happened actually, ultimately he fell victim to the law of unintended consequences. Sabe, he was a teacher, an educationist. Educated, knowledgeable, a diplomat. He was not a military in this sense. He was an organizer. So he could organize the early ELF and they organized even the Eritrean Liberation Army, but military strategy, zero. Political ideology, zero. He didn't understand these ideologies even, because it was not part of his cultural, political, educational baggage. Yeah. He knew about these things. He knew about communism, he knew about Arab socialism, he knew about Baathism, but more in an abstract way. He had no feeling for these things.
So that was the reason why he was overruled in the beginning of 70s and kicked away from the leadership of the Jabha. And
the point is, when those young trainees came back imbued with certain ideological, political, military concepts, he no longer understood them. And he made the mistake to believe that he still could guide them and could form them, and that these people would be willingly follow his leadership, his inspiration. He failed to understand, like many teachers fail to understand, that the students mature.
Definitely. Thank you for a good explanation. And then after, I stopped you before, so I would like to continue that point. So after Isas went to Allah and then collect these people and then try to reorganize a new group of movement.
Yes.
And what was the role of Sabe in this context?
You see, after Sabe had organized the transfer to Sudowa-Ela, he was somehow left out in the cold. He did not have direct contact with a group which moved from Sudowa-Ela to the north. There were people from those who had assembled in Aden and had went to Sudowa-Ela, who had returned from Sudowa-Ela to Aden, then had gone north to Sahel and whatever. There were also some people roaming in the Arab world, like Ramadan, trying to organize things. But the Sabe did not have a direct, strict line. He was no longer guiding that. The overall commander of the group moving from Sudowa-Ela to the north was Umaro, certainly someone with close links to Sabe in the past, but not a creature of Sabe, someone who had his own personality and standing, whose collaboration with Sabe was more on a pragmatic line, because Sabe was the one who could deliver what they needed when Umaro was commander of the 4th Division, and what he could deliver when he was there. Sabe tried to organize supplies for this group, but this group, being on the move, was not in a position to receive supplies. How? They could not, there were no organized things. So this group was very much on its own. So, even so, in this group, there were many people who were, let's say, accessible for Sabe, like Omaru. So the group who had gone from Zuduaela, a roundabout way to Sahel, under Abu Tiara, they also, Sabe had a good understanding with Abu Tiara, yeah. But they had no contact with them. Then he also, Sabe had no contact with a group in Ala, consolidating there under Isaias. Yeah. In addition, further elements that came up in 1609. Sabe had also organized some things in imitation of the Palestinians, and with Palestinian support, he organized attempts to hijack Ethiopian airline planes. There was an attempt in Frankfurt, and there was an attempt in Karachi in Pakistan. The leader of the team in Karachi was Ali Zaid Abdallah, who was captured and sentenced to prison.
The prison is Pakistan?
Or in Pakistan.
Okay.
And later, Sabe managed to talk the Pakistanis into releasing him earlier. And then the Ali Zaid Abdallah returned to Eritrea. And somehow he made his way and he joined later what became the EPLF in 71 or so, when the group from Zudaela had already arrived in the north. More of importance was that within the General Command majority faction, dissensions arose. The closer the preparations for the First National Congress drew to a close, the bigger dissensions between the different factions. And one faction centered around Baka finally separated, and this faction became known as the Obel Group. And among the leaders of this Obel Group were Adam
Not Imaro?
No. The leader of the Obel Group, the dissidents from Baka, were Adam Saleh, Ahmed Adam Umar, another of the Chinese trainees from the first group, Muhammad Adam Idris, and other people. From the Maria, there were Muhammad Hassan Abu Bakr and Umar Abu Shana, one of the old fighters. So they, partly for regionalist reasons, partly for personal reasons, Adam Saleh had been training in Iraq.
And these people, they had a link with Sabe?
No, they didn't have a link with Sabe. Yeah? But they, for their own reasons, they became hostile to the majority faction around Abdallah Idris, Ahmed Nasser, etc., etc. So, and they split and established themselves as the Obelion.
Obelion, okay.
So you had now three groups. You had the Obel group,
yes, go.
of some Bani Amma and Maria, the group from Zuduaela, mostly Muslims, but also some Christians there, and the purely Christian group, Self-Inetzanet in Ala. So, in November 17, the Ala group gave itself a leadership.
In October 1970, you mean? Or?
17.
Yes, okay.
At the meeting in Teklai, the 5-member leadership, Isaias Afeworki, Mesfin Hagos, Solomon Woldemariam, Tewelde Abraha,
yes.
and Asmeron Gerskia. Asmarom Gerskia is still with Isaias.
And not Tewolde Ejob?
Tewolde, also Abraham, no.
Tewolde Ejob?
Tewolde Ejob was not there. Solomon Wolde Maria was killed in 79, most likely. Mesfin Hagos is known as a 2000. He was as a marginalized there. So these five were leading this group as a there. Isaias was a nominal leader, but it was a group more of, well, at that time, a kind of collective leadership. But still, Isaias was, let's say, the driving brain behind. Asmarom, his trusted, true follower.
Asmarom Abraham.
Asmarom Gerskia.
Okay. Just to understand, how was EPLF, so Eritrean People Liberation Forces, at the beginning?
No, you had the Eritrean People's Liberation Forces coming from Suduaela.
Okay.
Good. You had the Selfie Tzanet.
Okay.
From Ala, then they went to Teklai, which is also in Zemenawi Bahri.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So these two forces, sometime between in spring 71 or so, they met in Zemenawi Bahri, and they agreed to cooperate with each other. There was no outright merger because, well, they did not fully trust each other.
Typical.
They had a different history, and a different way of formation. The ones having come from the field, Sudan, Aden, this long way from the south, north, this hardship. Those people who survived the trip to the north, they were very close to each other. So, and the Ala group was a politically unknown,
Political elite.
Huh?
Was it the political elite of this group?
No. The Ala group was a political unknown. Isaias they knew, sure. And they knew also that one of theirs, the Ramadan, had been a close collaborator. Isaias was known, but the others were not so known. So they did not have a clear idea where they stood, what is their aim, etc. So these two groups, which were henceforth known as People's Liberation Forces 1 and People's Liberation Forces 2. The Ala group was known as People Liberation Forces 2, and the Suduaela group, the People's Liberation Forces 1. So they decided to continue the dialogue and to find out what is a common ground, how can they cooperate with each other, how can it work. So meanwhile, Sabe was busy trying to organize supplies. So Obel Group, through its Maya members and through Abu Tiara, which had teamed up with the Obel from Sahel, had also had their links with Osman Saleh Sabe. And they were receiving some supplies through Osman Saleh Sabe. After the Suduaela group had arrived in the north, in Zemenawi Bahri, they also received some supplies. Also important is...
Also from Sabe?
From Sabe, yeah.
Okay.
Isaias did not receive supplies from Sabe, because the Sabe did not have any clear link and idea with him. Even so, Mesfin Hagos, who had also gone from Suduaela another way to the north, from there he had made his way to Ala and had joined the group of Isaias. So theoretically, as Mesfin was in the group who had the link with Sabe, through Mesfin he could have linked with Sabe, but the Mesfin according to what he told me and what I know, there was no link through him to Sabe in the early days of the Ala group. After he joined the Ala
directly
group.
not, okay.
Directly not, yeah. But Osman, he was busy abroad. He was trying to organize his supporters in a proper way in the Arab world, the officers, support bases, mass organizations, whatever, and to solicit funds, also to talk with the governments, yeah. And it was a hard time for him, actually, because both the Syrian government and the Iraqi government, they told him they will no longer support the Eritrean revolution if the Eritrean revolution does not manage to patch up its divisions. Because the secret services of these organizations, the military secret service, political secret service of these states, they had learned what is happening inside Eritrean revolution, inside the ELF, the splits, the dissensions, the various groups coming up. So they were not happy about it, yeah? Because for them, the Eritrean revolution is only useful if it is unified and controlled by them. So they were telling Sabe, get your act together, unify these groups. So Sabe was trying its level best to do that. But it was hard going. He even reached out to people from the general command somehow to patch up the differences. But those people in control of the general command, foremost was Abdullah Idris.
But he had no influence to the mainstream of ELF, not anymore after the 70s.
No, he did not. You see, what was left of the general command after people broke away or were arrested, he did not have a direct link there, but he tried at least.
Okay.
Anyhow, throughout 71, the different factions, they tried to consolidate, to maneuver, to organize themselves. Sabe was trying to organize itself outside. Then the organization managed, the ELF managed to successfully merge the two the army under a unified command. Abdullah Idris Military Committee. And they went ahead with the preparation for the National Congress.
In 71, okay.
In 71. Now in 71 they had this as a Congress, October 71, the Congress of Ar,
okay.
Where they had invited all the factions to come there. But nobody of the other factions came. Yeah. And on the eve of
election, maybe?
No, on the eve of the conference, a specific invitation was sent out to Isaias. Because the driving forces in the general command realized that without the Christians in the ELF, that it would be a very difficult situation for them. Yeah? So they tried to drive a wedge between Isaias and the other factions. They attacked the Obel group and nearly managed to completely disperse them, but some elements of the Obel group survived and reorganized, so they could not totally achieve their goal. And the Congress made various decisions concerning that reaffirming the position that there could be only one armed force in the field, meaning, and basically deciding if the others do not rejoin us, we have to destroy them. but the group of Isaiahs was explicitly taken out of that. So it was that one has to negotiate to bring it back into the fold peacefully. And the utmost efforts have to be done to reconcile also in the civilian population, the Muslims and the Christians, etc., etc. Then they elected a new leadership, a revolutionary council of
61?
No,
I guess.
no, the revolutionary council, I think, is of above 20 members.
Mm-hmm.
With it is Muhammad Adem as chairman.
Who's the head of, okay. Mm-hmm.
Which was like a slap into the face of Osman Saleh Sabe. His former mentor, later political enemy, being elected as the chairman of the ELF.
Mm-hmm.
In clear contravention of what had been decided in Adopa, that these people should no longer serve. So he was made their chairman. Vice chairman was made Huri Tetlabeiru, the
newcomer, okay.
The newcomer from Sweden,
Mm-hmm.
with communist inclinations,
Mm-hmm.
who also joined then as the Labour Party, and became the vice chairman. The son of Tetlabeiru, former chief administrator of Eritrea under Ethiopia, and then as an ambassador there, then member of the Supreme Council as in 67 or 68 of the ELF.
Mm.
Yeah. And Huri Tetla had been won over.
So Idris Muhammad Adem was the head of the ELF in this Congress.
Huri Tetla
Bairu was vice chair, exactly.
And Abdallah Idris, the head of the military.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
most powerful guy. Okay.
So the actual leader of the ELF were Huri Tetla and Abdallah Idris. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Huri Tetla, the ideologue, Abdallah Idris, the military leader. Yeah. In addition, they opted for a very strange organizational structure. Below the Revolutionary Council, they had an executive committee of 19 headed by Ibrahim Idris Totil.
Ibrahim Totil, okay. Mm-hmm.
The leader of the Islah movement in Sudan.
Mm-hmm.
Also strong communist leanings.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Totil, Huri, Abdallah Idris, and 4 or 5 others became the dominant leaders in the ELF. And they were the ones who were pushing for a military solution to the problems of the factions.
Mm-hmm.
So order was given out to destroy the Obel and to destroy the PLF-1. The PLF-2 was to be spared. Naturally, Sabe, having his ear on the ground and also having his informants still there around, he learned about these plans, and he succeeded to invite representatives of PLF-1, PLF-2, and the surviving Obel to Beirut in February 72.
Mm-hmm.
And in Beirut 72, the Qiyada al-Aman and the 3 factions signed an agreement that henceforth they would operate outside as the ELF, People's Liberation Forces, ELF, PLF, with the group around Sabe functioning as a foreign mission of the ELF, PLF, And the three groups inside OBL, PLF1 and PLF2 would work towards the unification of their forces to have a unified People's Liberation Force as a military wing of the ELF, PLF. As a result of that, Osman managed, he had now secured a clear link to the anti-ELF forces, and he started to send supplies to them. He had finally managed to convince the Iraqis and the Syrians and the South Yemenis to provide supplies. The Chinese by that time were useless because in 70 China had recognized Haile Selassie. China and Ethiopia had
a good relationship at the beginning of
they had the diplomatic relations, and the Chinese totally cut the links to the Eritreans. Then, with the aid of this support of the Eritrean foreign mission, ELF, PLF foreign mission, the different groups of the ELF, PLF started to cooperate militarily, draw closer together, and first PLF1 and PLF2, they unified and had the common leadership, the single leadership.
This is the military sector.
The military sector, yeah. The OBEL were still out. But in the first Eritrean civil war had started then between the ELF and these factions, and the ELF attacked the OBEL, they attacked the PLF1, and they also attacked when they learned that Isaias had thrown in his lot with the others, they also attacked the ELF. The PLF,
the Isaias group.
The Isaias group. And a turning point in the civil war was the battle of Guenter, which is actually on Sudanese soil. Under heavy pressure by the ELF, the forces of PLF1 and PLF2, also jointly, had withdrawn on Sudanese soil, and there the ELF besieged them in Guenter and was about to overrun them.
The Sudanese, okay?
No, the ELF.
So the ELF army overran the army of EPLF.
No, the PLFs, the two PLFs who were fighting together, they tried to overrun them. They besieged them in this position in Guenter and were about to close in and to overrun them. Then the Sudanese army stepped in. Ahmed Kara, the responsible on the Sudanese side for Eritrean matters, former police commissioner in the military and the security, he had always been responsible for the Eritrean dossier. He stepped in. He imposed.
That was Ahmed Kara.
Ahmed Kara.
Okay.
He stepped in. He imposed a ceasefire and cordoned off the two groups, enabling the PLF, ELF to withdraw back into Eritrea and to gain enough
energy,
gain enough of the head start to be able to escape and evade the pursuing ELF force. So Ahmed Kara is very much responsible for saving the ass of the nascent EPLF. Even though today the EPLF would be hard pressed to admit it, but that was very crucial for them. It is highly doubtful that they would have survived the onslaught of the ELF.
Amazing. Amazing, Guenter.
I interviewed Ahmed Kara in August or September 1980 in Khartoum.
Is he still alive?
No, he's dead now.
Okay.
But I knew his brother who had been studying in Munich as a hotel catering. And so I had an opening to him, and as I was invited to his house, I even was introduced to his wife, which is for Sudanese very important, which shows you are a trusted friend. So he was talking openly with me.
Okay.